Hello friends, and welcome to another reaction video. If you're new here, my name is Nate and I typically do reaction videos comparing the United States to other parts of the world. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. In today's video, brought to you by Second Thought, we are going to be watching Are We Living Through the End of an Empire? And this has to deal with the United States being that empire. It'll be interesting. I know a lot of people typically want to compare any empire to the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire or the decline of the Roman Empire or what have you. But let's see what these guys have to say. Their videos are usually pretty in-depth, pretty well done. I have reacted to a couple of their videos before. So without any more chatter, let's just get into the video.
Episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, join our growing Discord server, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. Throughout the well-worn pages of history, empires have risen, grown to prominence, and collapsed into the mist of time. The Roman Empire, stretching from the sweltering sands of Africa to the murky woods of northern England. The British Empire and her dominance of the Seven Seas. Radio Shack. All of these and more have become the stuff of legend, each with their own stories of success, expansion, and ultimately collapse, unable to bear the weight of their inherent contradictions. But are all empires destined to meet this fate? And the question on everyone's mind, probably because it's the title of this video, are we living through the end of an empire? In this episode, we'll take a look at the precarious position of the United States and consider some historic parallels to assess whether the US is really in decline. All right.
Okay, so before we get too far into it, I'm going to answer that question and say yes. Unfortunately, I do believe the United States is in a decline. How much and how far we've gone to be determined, but I do feel like the US is not on the upward slope anymore.
Here we go. I'm ready. Nope, that's terrible. All right, I'm ready. Rome. Or are we doing this as two takes? Okay, here we go. I'm ready. Rome. The empire all other empires aspire to be. From their breathtaking architecture, to their lavish feasts, to their penchant for feeding people they don't like to wild animals, Rome is truly the shining example of what other nations can only hope to accomplish. We can't really talk about empires or empires in decline without talking about the Roman one. And it just so happens that Americans, from politicians to far-right history YouTubers, love to compare the US to Rome. So, is there something to this comparison? Is the US the new Rome? In a lovely bit of cosmic irony, the first book of Edward Gibbon's ambitious 6-volume work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was published in 1776, on the eve of the birth of a new empire. One that would go on to become arguably the most powerful in history. In some ways, the United States and the Roman Empire do have a lot in common.
Behold, dear Petronius, my new Rome.
An insatiable desire for expansion, extreme inequality, a globe-spanning network of influence, a penchant for chattel slavery, military dominance, and decadent displays of wealth. There have been countless books, essays, political diatribes, and social media posts earnestly comparing the United States to Rome, and often for good reason. Both empires were bogged down in endless wars, both displayed a shocking level of wealth inequality, both suffered economic crises that commentators in both eras were certain would spell the final end of the golden age of civilization. And if we're being honest, both had about the same response to disease outbreaks, which is to say those in power let a whole lot of people die and isolated themselves as best they could. But we should also note that a lot of the people making these comparisons are only doing it because they have this weird thing about mythologizing the United States. It's a very young country, comparatively speaking, so what better way to afford it a little extra grandeur than giving ourselves the title of the New Rome, the shining city on a hill, the glorious republic that commands the world itself. That fits very nicely into the whole manifest destiny, American exceptionalism thing. We'll get back to that towards the end of the video. But first, we need to address what the end of an empire actually looks like. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the fall of Rome. Despite the popularity of the phrase, most academics have moved on from the term fall when talking about the Roman Empire. The consensus now is that it wasn't any single inflection point that triggered a dramatic collapse, but an agonizing, generations-long slide into a decreased standing in the world. There wasn't one single point where we could say Rome was an empire yesterday and today it's a failed project. The real world doesn't work like that. There were certainly some instances one could point to as chapter markers near the end of the story. For example, around the year 476, there wasn't really an emperor claiming the vast swaths of land the empire had once held with an iron fist. But if we're looking for a Marvel-esque announcement that Rome has fallen, we're not gonna find one. What we can trace, and it's easier to do so in retrospect, is a series of minor failures that go unaddressed. Crumbling infrastructure due to lack of investment, rampant corruption, severe inequality, dwindling trust in institutions or leadership, humiliating military defeat, or endless conflict sapping resources.
Okay. All of these look eerily familiar, except for the humiliating defeat. I feel like that one may not... We don't have too many military defeats. If that's one thing the United States will never let happen, is a declining military. Not going to happen. They will sap every other resource from this country to fund the military. And being that I was a part of the military at the time, I was okay with it. Now, seeing the other side and actually opening my eyes to a whole world of other issues, that's not okay. But crumbling infrastructure, we see that in every small town and city in the United States. Rampant corruption, just look at the United States government. Severe inequality, again, all over the place, from between sexes and between races, depending on where you live. Dwindling trust, yes, a lot of people are not trusting the U.S. government much. A lot of failures.
These all add up to a very real challenge to the structure of an empire. To take the Roman example, the city of Rome itself had been sacked multiple times, but what really did the city in was when the supply chain failed. State-subsidized grain shipments on state-subsidized ships tied up at state-subsidized docks. Eventually, as the state was less able or willing to maintain these mundane but crucial projects, things sort of just fell apart over time. It's never one big collapse, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Countless seemingly insignificant failures that together add up to an inability to function. A useful way to think about this can be found in Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, which is now actually a really good show if you're into sci-fi. Much like Harry Seldon prophesied a series of crises along the path of the Empire's long and painful collapse, so too can we take a step back and see a handful of big red dots on the timeline of American decline. I don't want to spoil the show, but suffice it to say that it has a really good understanding of the scale we're talking about when looking at the process of decline. It's not a quick and dramatic collapse. These things take decades or even centuries, but the cracks are already there. And every once in a while, a pillar buckles. The Great Depression, the Red Scares and McCarthyist pogroms, 9/11, the 2008 financial crash and Great Recession, COVID, and now the handful of crises that have been simmering for decades and are coming to a head. The climate crisis and the collapse of US imperial control of the periphery. We're losing ground economically, militarily, and geopolitically to China. The US regime's steadfast support for the genocide of the Palestinian people has ensured no country in the Third World will ever believe our rhetoric about self-determination and freedom again. Just like that, an entire generation of Americans disabused of the myth that we're the good guys. And this is where the usual Western analysis begins to fail. A lot of people make the mistake of attributing crises of empire to the failures or excesses of individual leaders or people or groups with influence. It's always the other team that's making things go wrong. It's Trump on immigration and LGBT rights. It's Biden on funding endless proxy wars. While megalomaniacs or senile old warmongers can certainly make things worse, The underlying logic of the system in which they operate is the determining factor in how the crises they lead us through are handled. Take COVID, for example.
I know that we will achieve victory and quickly return to the path of exceptional health, safety, and prosperity for all of our citizens. We have to get back to work. Our people want to work. They want to go back. They have to go back.
Because the United States follows a capitalist economic philosophy, the key consideration during the pandemic was keeping the gears of the market turning, regardless of the human toll. The prime directive of capitalism is the accumulation of capital, and if that means we have to sacrifice low-paid workers on the altar of profit, so be it. There was no meaningful difference between Trump and Biden on this issue, despite the two leaders being characterized as polar opposites by the media class. If you look beneath the aesthetic differences between the two major parties, if you ignore the bombastic rhetoric and empty posturing on social issues and look strictly at the economic base of the system we live under, it's clear that every single great man one could point to is beholden to the same interests, and is therefore more of a byproduct of the system than a leader that changes it.
This is unfortunately true. You know, some leaders are better than others. Some leaders carry more empathy than others, make a better judgment call than others, but they're all the product of the same system. Capitalism is not the greatest system. That it ignores the workers and is driven strictly just by, like what he said, capital. So there's got to be a mix. There's got to be a blend of these different systems. I don't have the answer, to all of this, but I know that one or the other is not the way to go. There's got to be a mixture of all of it, and unfortunately, the president of the United States, no matter how good of a leader he is, no matter how well he or she may do, they're still a part of the system. They're still a victim, or not a victim, but they aren't the cause, but they're in it. So what can they do? The government is based on a series of checks and balances for good reason, but that also means that they are limited in their power to make decisions that could benefit the country and the people. So it's a touchy one. It's a tough one.
Okay, so if it's not the leaders, then what makes the difference between empires that endure and empires that fall? Every nation and empire in history has faced challenges. Nothing exists in a vacuum. So what sets apart an empire that meets these challenges and one that's on the way out? In a nutshell, resilience. The ability of the system to react to, adapt to, and overcome the challenges they're presented with. Rebuilding key infrastructure after a natural disaster. Reassessing the system after an economic crisis to make sure it doesn't happen again. Taking swift action to protect people from a major disease outbreak. You can probably see where I'm going with all this. Take infrastructure. Flint, Michigan still has undrinkable water, despite the government finally promising to replace the water lines. Much of New Orleans is still destroyed or underwater 18 years after Hurricane Katrina. We have trains going off the rails at a rate of 4.8 derailments per day, many of those trains carrying toxic chemicals, as we saw firsthand when we went to East Palestine, Ohio earlier this year. The United States is notorious for letting its infrastructure fail and never repairing it. When it comes to economic disasters, things aren't any better. In the wake of the 07-08 financial crash and the recession that followed, nearly 10 million Americans lost their homes. Those homes were snatched up by institutional investors like BlackRock, and most of them are still held hostage on the rental market today. Did the government do anything about the conditions that led up to this crisis? Not really. They gave a couple people a slap on the wrist, but the vast majority of the criminal executives that profited from the real estate bubble and swindled the American people got off scot-free. And now, experts are saying it kinda looks like there's another bubble brewing. Most Americans are worse off now than they were in 2007. They haven't recovered. And if there is another crash, things will get even worse for even more people. Then, of course, there's COVID. Was there an answer to curbing the death toll of the pandemic? Yes. Did American leadership know what it was? Yes. Did they follow the science and prevent those deaths? No, they did not. In fact, they did the opposite, waxing poetic about the importance of the market and how valued our frontline workers are. And then they moved on. Over 1 million people died so the line wouldn't go down for a bit. Yet another failure of the American empire. The United States relies on a system that is not and can never be resilient. Capitalism demands running the leanest operation possible. No safety nets, no guardrails. Everything delivered at the last possible moment in the bare minimum amount. Corners cut at all levels of enterprise. When all the reasonable cuts have been made, then they come for the nickels and dimes. That means stripping benefits. No more pensions, no more healthcare, no more vacation time or parental leave. It means moving from employment to gig work, full-time hours to piecemeal contracts. And all of this is just on the domestic front. Those in power don't care if they have a pissed-off workforce. They know we have to accept whatever job we can get or we starve. There's no choice there.
That is just spot on the truth. They don't care because they know we don't have a choice. We have to work in order to survive. So we're going to take what we can and deal with it.
What they do care about is maintaining their geopolitical interests abroad. But once again, because of the logic of capitalism, the empire's grip is slipping. When we're the only game in town, we can give developing countries loans with obscenely exploitative conditions. We can force them to privatize, to sell off their industry to American investors, to buy back the goods that their own resources produced at exorbitant rates. Of course, the rest of the world hates us. But we don't care. We're the dominant world power. So in our arrogance, we outsource all our manufacturing to China to cut costs. Meanwhile, China has been taking the long view, thinking 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, following common sense development plans, raising the standard of living of their people, building high-tech, modern cities that blow our infrastructure and productive capacity out of the water. And then, eventually, while we were busy bombing a dozen countries at once and making enemies around the world, China extends their hand in collaboration. Now there's a second economic superpower in the mix, one that offers development aid without the ridiculous requirements, one that benefits all involved parties, that looks ahead to a more connected, collaborative future and not one of imperialist domination. It's no wonder the US is losing trade deals and borrowers left and right. They're simply a better alternative. And when a country that has become entirely dependent on extracting wealth from the third world loses the ability to do so, what happens? They lash out. They get more violent. They start proxy wars in geostrategic locations to try to regain the upper hand. When a more lucrative or more strategic option becomes available, they dump their previous lackey and leave them to implode and be carved up by foreign investors. There's a reason we're looking at war with Russia over Ukraine, war with China over Taiwan, and war with the entire Arab world over Israel. It's because war is the last chance the US empire has to give itself a shot in the arm and limp along for another few decades as the dominant power. Will it work? We'll see.
Okay, so I'm not at all condoning China and their government system structure. However, they are thinking long game here. And that's what we as the United States should be doing, thinking long term. But unfortunately, we aren't. And we are looking at just the next fix, basically. Just to put a Band-Aid on it and keep going. And that's not sustainable at all.
But here's the thing we really need to internalize. We now live in a time where there is no longer anyone alive who remembers a time before American global dominance. Since World War II, and certainly since the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US has had very nearly uncontested control of the world. This has led to a perception among Americans, even those who are critical of the country's behavior, that the US really is special. That our empire won't go the way of all the others. That somehow we'll overcome all these challenges and avoid collapse or fading into irrelevance. We all have to grapple with the fact that this will not be the case. We are living through the end of an empire. It may not seem dramatic, it might not fit the apocalyptic vision of collapse we've come to expect, it may take another 100 years, but the US is on the way out. The contradictions have become so sharp and the failures so frequent that it should be clear to all but the most devoted acolytes to the cult of capitalism that the American empire has begun to wane.
Okay, so that was kind of depressing, but I kind of had an idea that that's the way it was going to be. Now, is it too late? Is it too late to make the necessary changes to turn the empire around? I don't want to say it is, but in order for the United States to pick back up and do the right thing, some massive changes need to be made. And I don't see them being made. Not with the current structure, not with the current state of affairs with the government, with the voting issues, with LGBTQ plus rights, with women's rights. We're going backwards. Everything that we have done up to a few years ago, we were progressing. We were getting better. We were, giving rights to those who deserve rights, because we all deserve the same rights. And now we're slowly chipping those back away, and we're going backwards. So in order for the United States to turn around, and I'm not going to say the term, be great again, because no. But in order for the U.S. to be better, some massive changes have to be made. And some of those changes people aren't going to be willing to do, or they don't want, I don't want to say civil war or anything like that, but it almost feels like there has to be a massive revolt from the American people against the government, against corporations, in order to show them, hey, you know what, we're not taking this anymore. We're going to stand up, and we're going to demand that you protect us like you should be. A government for the people, by the people, right? Like France, their workers, their workforce, they went to the streets en masse. And I don't know all the details, what came out of it and all of that, but that's what needs to happen here. Not these little pockets of protests of, things, but the entire country needs to come together. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen because the entire country is divided. I'm not saying everybody needs to think the same way, but we all have to have the same common goal of just being protected and having our government look after us, right? And this, like he said, this might take generations for the actual fall of the empire. Hopefully, my kids don't have to go through it. Hopefully we can do some things and turn it around. I have hope, because the younger generation now are paying attention to politics, to world events. And, when I was younger, some of us did. I didn't care to. It didn't interest me in the point that I wanted to pay attention to it. And that was a mistake. But I feel like the younger generation now, they know that it's a mistake not to pay attention anymore. And so they are. And I feel like at some point down the line, it will slowly start to turn around once we get these younger generations into power. Comes up with a whole other slew of questions and problems. Does power corrupt people? Are you corrupt before you get power? Way too in-depth for this video, but I did enjoy that, and I'm kind of on the same page as he is. I feel like the U.S. is in a decline. It's unfortunate, and I don't like to see it happen, but we got to make a change. We got to do something to change it. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like the video. Feel free to subscribe if you like this type of content. Check out some of my other reaction videos. And in case you noticed and you haven't been here before, yes, I have 41 staples in my head thanks to my recent brain surgery. Doing well. It's still numb from here to here, but you know, it doesn't hurt too much anymore. So if you notice that during the video, you know, shining staples. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you. And until next time, I'll catch you later.